Controllers should be simple and clean, ideally containing only a few lines of code. Today, I'll show you how to achieve that. The first and easiest step in refactoring your controller is to use request classes instead of handling validation directly in the controller. If your controller currently has inline validation like this, remove it. Instead, create a request class and move your validation rules there. Then, in your controller method, replace the validation logic by adding the newly created request class as a method parameter. Validation will now be processed automatically. To demonstrate this, I've created a simple request class and controller. I added a DD function at the beginning of the controller method so you can see the result. For an invalid request, the DD line is never reached. For a valid request, the code proceeds as expected. This approach keeps your controllers clean and your validation logic organized. Controllers should only handle requests and should not contain any business logic. This is the second improvement you can implement. To achieve this, create a separate service class where you move the logic of your code. Then, inject this service into your controller method using dependency injection. Do not use the new keyword for instantiation. The reason for avoiding new will be explained in future videos. Your controller should simply call an action in the service class, passing input data from your request class. You can retrieve the data using input to get a specific field, validated to get all validated fields based on your rules, or all to retrieve all input data. An even better option is to use data transfer objects, but I will cover that in a separate video. Your service class may return a result, but it should not return a response, like in the controller, because that's not its responsibility. The controller is responsible for returning the response. You can either use Laravel resources to format the response or return it directly, but it should only be done once. If your business logic encounters an issue that requires a different response, you should handle it using exceptions. For instance, your code might send a request to an external API, and you can't be sure it won't fail. In such cases, you may want to return a different response. However, don't do what you see on the screen right now. A better approach is to throw an exception and then catch it, but adding try-catch blocks in many controllers isn't ideal either. Instead, remove the try-catch from your controller and go to the Bootstrap app file. There, you can handle exceptions inside the withExceptions method. You can create your own exception handling system and define a global approach for dealing with them. This way, you won't need try-catch blocks in your controllers, but the exceptions will still be caught and return the expected response. The final point for this video is changing how you create controllers. But before explaining this concept, you need to understand that the reason for using this approach depends on your project's architecture. If you want to follow the solid principles and are starting a new project, you should definitely use them. However, if you're working with legacy code, there's no reason to modify existing controllers just to implement this concept. Using both approaches simultaneously is even worse. Now let's break it down. The S in solid stands for single responsibility, meaning a class should have only one reason to change. If you have a controller with CRUD actions, you should split each action into separate controllers. For example, you could create controllers like delete user controller, add user controller, and so on. Additionally, you can use the PHP magic method invoke instead of specifying individual method names in the controller. Let's look at how this modified controller would look. This approach also allows you to simplify your routes because invoke will be called automatically, so you don't need to specify the method name. You might be asking if I always follow this approach. The answer is, it depends. There is still room for improvement in this code, but some changes I would make aren't directly related to this video, such as using interfaces. This controller is much cleaner than one that doesn't implement any of the concepts mentioned, but everything depends on the project's architecture. Generally, the most important thing is consistency in your code. I hope that some of the improvements presented here will be useful to you.